January 12, 1946. Camp Hokua, territory of Hawaii. The rain came down in sheets, a relentless drumming against the corrugated tin roof of Barracks C. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and the faint, metallic scent of 50 iron cots lined in perfect rows. Hisako pulled the thin blanket tighter around Emi's shoulders. The girl, barely 17, had been startled awake by a sudden clap of thunder that echoed like an artillery shell from a life they were supposed to be leaving behind. A beam of light cut through the gloom as the American guard, a young corporal with a face too soft for his uniform, made his nightly rounds. He paused, his torchlight briefly illuminating the sign nailed to the central post. Lights out at 10 p.m. Absolute quiet. His gaze lingered for a moment on the two women, but his expression held no malice, only a weary sort of duty. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and moved on, his boots squelching softly in the mud outside. "Daijobu," Hisako whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "We are safe here." Stories like this remind us that understanding can be found in the most unexpected places. If you find value in this perspective, consider subscribing and letting us know what country you are watching from. 3 weeks earlier, the mess hall. December 1945. Camp Hokua, territory of Hawaii. The humidity of the island clung to Hisako's skin like a second unwelcome garment. It was a dampness that promised life to the lush, aggressive greenery outside the barbed wire. But inside the barracks, it only seemed to cultivate a quiet sort of decay. For 2 days, they had been processed, their names and former lives reduced to serial numbers on a manila tag. Now, for the first time, they were being led to the mess hall for their evening meal. Hisako kept her eyes fixed on the back of the woman in front of her, the gray fabric of their identical uniforms a dreary, unending river. As a nurse, she was trained to observe, to assess a situation with clinical detachment, but here, she was simply one of 50 women, her skills and identity stripped away. The guards, young American men whose faces seemed caught between boyhood and the harshness of war, flanked their silent procession. They did not shout. They did not shove. Their silence was, in its own way, more unnerving than outright hostility. The mess hall was a long wooden structure that smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled potatoes. Hisako had steeled herself for the worst. Filth, rough-hewn tables, the degradation she had been taught to expect from the enemy. But as they filed in, a collective, stifled gasp rippled through the line. The tables were not bare. They were covered end to end with stark white tablecloths. The effect was jarring. The cloths were not of fine linen, merely simple, laundered cotton, yet their presence suggested an order, a civility that felt profoundly out of place. They were a blank slate in a world that had been anything but. Hisako found her assigned seat, her fingers hesitating before touching the clean, crisp fabric. It was a small detail, a meaningless gesture in the grand machinery of post-war administration, yet it sent a fissure through her certainty. Monsters did not bother with white tablecloths. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, a posture of discipline that had been ingrained in her since childhood. Around her, the other women did the same. They were a portrait of silent compliance, but beneath the surface, a current of confusion ran deep. The hall was filled with the low clatter of metal trays being prepared behind a serving counter, the murmur of the guards' English, a language that sounded harsh and alien. A large hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Regulations of the Geneva Convention are observed in this facility." Source: Camp Establishment Directives, 1945. It meant little to most of them, but the white tablecloths meant something. They were an anomaly, a question mark laid out before them. Hisako looked down at the smooth, unblemished surface, and for a fleeting moment, she was not a prisoner of war. She was a guest at a strange, silent banquet, waiting for a meal she could not possibly imagine. A metal cart squeaked as it was wheeled out from the kitchen, its contents hidden from view. The first meal was about to begin. The cart stopped beside their table. A prisoner assigned to kitchen duty, a woman Hisako did not recognize, placed a metal tray in front of each of them without a word. On it, the meal was arranged with a strange precision. There were 2 slices of pale bread, cut into perfect squares. Beside them sat a small, waxy, paper-wrapped pat of a yellow butter and a tin cup filled to the brim with a stark white liquid. Milk. It was a child's meal, simple and bewildering. Hisako stared at the food. In Japan, a meal was built around a bowl of steaming rice, the anchor of any sustenance. This collection of bland colors and shapes felt empty, devoid of warmth or substance. The women exchanged wary glances. The bread was soft and yielding to the touch, unlike the dense, dark loaves they occasionally saw in the cities. The milk smelled unfamiliar, rich and animalian. Whispers, quiet as rustling leaves, passed between the older women. Was it safe? Was it merely leftovers, unfit for the soldiers? The fear was a cold knot in Hisako's stomach. They were utterly powerless, their lives dependent on the whims of their captors. To eat was an act of trust they could not afford. To refuse was an act of defiance they could not risk. Her gaze swept the room and landed on a small table near the kitchens, where a young American corporal sat. It was the same guard from the night before, the one with the weary face. A tray identical to theirs was placed before him. He picked up a slice of bread, unwrapped the butter with practiced fingers, and spread the yellow fat from edge to edge. He ate with an unthinking rhythm, tearing off pieces of the bread and washing them down with long swallows of milk. He was not testing it for poison. He was not savoring a delicacy. He was simply eating his dinner. It was a standard meal issued to American servicemen, a fact lost on the women who received it. Watching him, the tension in Hisako's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. The logic was undeniable. They would not poison their own. The food was not a punishment. It was merely their food. A faint flush of shame warmed her cheeks for her own fearful suspicions. She picked up her slice of bread. It was spongy and tasteless. She hesitantly tried the butter, and its creamy, salty richness was a small shock to her palate. She drank the milk, its coldness a strange sensation. It was not a satisfying meal, but it was nourishment. One by one, the other women followed her lead, their movements hesitant at first, then more certain. They ate in their customary silence. The only sounds the soft tearing of bread and the quiet clicks of tin cups set down on the white tablecloths. The cloths, she noted, were no longer pristine. A few crumbs and a stray smear of butter now marked their surfaces. They had left their mark on this strange new world, however small. For several days, the meals followed a predictable, monotonous pattern. The soft bread, the small pats of butter, the cold milk. A routine began to form, and with it came a fragile sense of predictability. The initial terror had subsided into a dull, resigned watchfulness. Then, one evening, a new item appeared on their trays, nestled beside the familiar slices of bread. They were sticks of a brilliant golden brown, piled in a small mound, radiating a faint warmth. A low murmur passed through the room. Hisako picked one up. It was light, rigid, and slightly greasy to the touch. It smelled of hot oil and salt, a savory aroma that was both enticing and strange. She studied it, turning it over in her fingers. What was it? The older woman beside her, Mrs. Sato, leaned in and whispered, her voice tight with suspicion. Perhaps they are roots of some kind, fried. The idea sent a ripple of unease through the nearby women. Roots could be anything, some nutritious, others poisonous. Once again, the food sat untouched. They were locked in a silent standoff with the unknown. Hisako looked around. Even the American guards seemed to be eating them with relish, scooping them up by the handful. But the image of the corporal eating bread had settled one fear. This was a new test. Her training as a nurse made her cautious, her mind cataloging possibilities she would rather ignore. The stalemate was broken by Emi, the young girl Hisako had comforted during the storm. Always more curious than afraid, Emi separated her chopsticks, a small comfort of home they had been allowed to keep, and deftly picked up one of the golden sticks. She brought it to her nose, sniffing it like a cautious animal. Then she glanced at Hisako, her eyes wide with a mixture of daring and apprehension. Hisako gave her the slightest of nods, an almost imperceptible permission. Emi took a small, hesitant bite. A loud, distinct crunch echoed in the quiet hall. Every eye was on her. Emi's expression transformed from uncertainty to wide-eyed astonishment. She chewed thoughtfully, then took another, larger bite. A slow smile spread across her face. "Imo," she whispered, the Japanese word for potato. She looked at Hisako, her voice now filled with delighted discovery. "It is only potato." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the women. Potato. It was a humble, familiar food, a staple from their own villages. The enemy had not given them strange roots, but a common vegetable prepared in an uncommon way. Hisako tried one herself. The outside was crisp and salty, giving way to a soft, floury interior. It was simple, yet deeply satisfying. Soon the sound of soft crunching filled the room. Small grease stains, like tiny maps of their shared experience, began to dot the surfaces of the white tablecloths. The meal was surprisingly pleasant, and yet, as Hisako ate the last of her portion, she felt that something was missing. The potatoes were good, but they were plain. They felt like an accompaniment to a main dish that was not there. The meal felt incomplete, a sentence without its final punctuation. The next day, the golden potatoes returned. A quiet ripple of approval went through the room as the trays were set down. But this time, they were not alone. Placed in the center of each table, standing like a strange crimson sentinel on the expanse of the white tablecloth, was a glass bottle. It was filled with a thick, opaque liquid, a shade of red so vibrant it seemed unnatural. The label was a confusion of English words, the largest of which was ketchup. The name meant nothing to them. The women stared at it, their chopsticks frozen midair. It was too bright to be a soy sauce, too thick to be a vinegar. One of the older women near the end of the table muttered that it looked like a Western medicine for coughs, and a chill of apprehension fell over the group. The idea of being medicated without their consent was a deep and primal fear. Hisako felt a familiar knot of caution tighten within her. She motioned to Mrs. Sato, the woman who had lived near a port city and picked up fragments of the foreigner's language. Mrs. Sato leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration as she squinted at the label. Her finger traced the smaller letters beneath the main word. "Tu, ma, tu," she sounded out slowly. The word for tomato, was one of the few Western words that had entered the Japanese language. A wave of recognition, followed by deeper confusion, washed over the women. Nuok sa chachua? It made no sense. Tomato sauce, in their experience, was part of a savory dish, something cooked, never served cold and raw as a condiment for potatoes. Driven by a nurse's need to analyze, Hisako reached out and carefully twisted the metal cap. It came off with a soft pop. She brought the opening of the bottle to her nose and inhaled cautiously. The smell was sharp, almost aggressive. It was not the earthy, sun-warmed scent of a fresh tomato. It was a powerful wave of vinegar and an underlying cloying sweetness that coated the back of her throat. She pulled back, her nose wrinkling in distaste. "It is sweet," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and revulsion. The bottle was passed around, each woman sniffing it and reacting with the same bewildered frown. "Why is it so sweet?" The question hung unspoken in the air, a testament to the vast cultural gulf that separated them from their captors. On the pure field of the white tablecloth, the bottle of ketchup stood as an indigestible symbol of everything they did not understand. The meal concluded in silence. The potatoes were eaten, but not a single drop of the red sauce was touched. When the kitchen staff came to clear the tables, the bottles were collected, their contents undisturbed, their mystery unsolved. The red bottles reappeared for a third day, and then a fourth. They became a silent, stubborn part of the mealtime ritual. The women developed a routine of ignoring them, working their way through the potatoes with a determined plainness. The ketchup bottles sat on the white tablecloths like unwanted guests, their bright color a small act of defiance against the muted tones of the camp. They represented a line the prisoners were unwilling to cross, a final bastion of their own culinary identity. From his table, Corporal Miller observed this quiet resistance. He was young, barely out of his teens, with a farmer's hands and a gentle disposition that seemed ill-suited for war. He had noticed their hesitation from the first day, and now their continued refusal of the condiment seemed to trouble him not as an act of insubordination, but as a failure of hospitality, however strange that concept was in a prison camp. On the fifth day, he made a decision. After finishing his own meal, he stood up and walked over to Hisako's table. The women tensed, their chopsticks freezing over their trays. Had they done something wrong? Miller offered a small, disarming smile. He did not speak. Instead, he reached for their untouched bottle of ketchup. With practiced ease, he uncapped it and poured a small, neat circle of the red sauce onto a clean spot on Emmy's empty tray. Then, he picked up one of her leftover potato sticks. He looked from the potato to the sauce and then to the women, his eyes conveying a simple instruction. He dipped the golden end of the potato into the crimson pool, ensuring it was well coated. He brought it to his lips and ate it in one bite, a distinct crunch breaking the hall's silence. He chewed, swallowed, and then smiled again, wider this time. He pointed from the ketchup to his own mouth and gave a definitive, encouraging nod. It was a simple, nonverbal gesture, the kind of communication that bridged impassable language barriers in camps across the world. There was no command in his action, no mockery. It was an invitation. Hisako watched his face, searching for any sign of deceit, but found only a clumsy, earnest desire to share something he clearly enjoyed. It cannot be that bad, she thought to herself. The thought was a revelation. For the first time, she was not assessing a threat, but considering a possibility. The eyes of every woman at her table were now on her. She was the nurse, the one they looked to for quiet guidance. The corporal had offered a gesture of peace, however small. To refuse it now would be an insult. Hisako took a slow, steadying breath. She picked up her last remaining potato stick. Slowly, deliberately, she reached it across the white tablecloth toward the small, glistening red circle. The tip of the potato stick touched the sauce. The crimson liquid clung to the golden tip, a stark and alien combination. Hisako lifted it, her hand steady, and brought it to her mouth. She closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing for an unpleasant medicine. She took the bite. For a single, suspended moment, there was only the familiar, satisfying crunch of the potato. Then, the flavor of the ketchup bloomed across her tongue. It was not the simple, cloying sweetness she had smelled in the bottle. An initial rush of sweetness was immediately cut by a sharp, vinegary tang that made her mouth water. This acidity, in turn, perfectly balanced the rich, salty, earthy flavor of the fried potato. The two opposing tastes did not fight. They merged, creating a third, entirely new flavor that was complex, vibrant, and deeply, unexpectedly pleasant. It was good. It was shockingly good. A small smile touched Hisako's lips. It was an involuntary reaction, a genuine expression of delight that she had not felt in months. A flicker of something akin to guilt, the absurdity of enjoying an enemy's food with such relish, was instantly extinguished by pure, simple astonishment. She opened her eyes and saw the corporal still watching, his own smile widening as he saw her reaction. He gave another nod, as if to say, "See, I told you so." Her expression was all the encouragement the other women needed. Emmy, ever the bold one, was the first to follow, giggling as the surprising taste hit her. Then another woman tried, and another. A low buzz of murmurs replaced the oppressive silence. It was a sound of discovery, of shared surprise. "Oishi," someone whispered. Delicious. The word felt foreign and yet perfectly appropriate in this strange new context. The single bottle of ketchup was soon in high demand, being passed carefully from hand to hand down the long table. The first tentative giggle gave way to a few more. For the first time since their arrival, the room did not feel like a prison. The rigid postures softened. The women looked at one another, their eyes alight with a common human experience that transcended their circumstances. It was no longer a mess hall for prisoners of war. For a few brief minutes, it was simply a room full of people discovering a new taste together, leaving small, happy red smudges on the white tablecloths as evidence of their small feast. The discovery of ketchup had changed something fundamental in the mess hall. The meals were no longer just a means of survival. They became a time of quiet, shared experience. A bottle would be passed with a knowing glance, a small smile exchanged as a potato was dipped. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a low, comfortable hum of activity. This fragile truce, however, was built on the isolated reality of the camp, and the world outside had not forgotten the war. The intrusion came in the form of a discarded local newspaper, left behind on a bench by one of the civilian cleaning staff. It was a flimsy, gray document, printed on cheap paper that felt rough to the touch. Mrs. Sato, whose English was improving with each passing day, picked it up out of curiosity. The women gathered around her as she spread the paper out on the white tablecloth after the meal, its dark, angry headlines a stark contrast to the clean fabric. Her finger traced a column of text near the back page. It was a letter to the editor. As she began to translate in a low, halting whisper, the newfound lightness in the room evaporated. The words were venomous. The writer spoke of American boys who would never come home, and of the insult of coddling the enemy on their own soil. It called the provision of decent food and clean lodging an affront to the memory of the dead. It argued that they, the prisoners, deserved nothing but the harshest of conditions. A heavy, cold silence fell over the table. The ketchup bottle, still half full, suddenly seemed garish and foolish. Hisako felt a familiar chill return, the feeling of being despised, of being seen not as a person, but as a symbol of hatred. Just then, her eyes were drawn to the far side of the hall. A senior officer, a captain with a stern face and sharp creases in his uniform, was speaking to Corporal Miller. Hisako could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The captain's voice was a low, angry buzz. He gestured sharply toward their tables, his hand slicing through the air. Corporal Miller stood rigidly at attention, his gaze fixed on the floor. He did not defend himself. He only nodded, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When the captain finally turned and strode away, Miller remained frozen for a moment before turning back to his duties. He avoided looking in their direction. He avoided meeting Hisako's eye. The connection was painfully clear. His simple act of kindness, of demonstrating the ketchup, had been noticed and condemned. Hisako looked down at the newspaper. The world was far more complicated than a simple taste test. Kindness, she now understood, was not an official policy. It was the choice of an individual, and that choice had consequences. The optimism of yesterday vanished, replaced by a harsh reality. A bottle of sauce could not end a war. It could only perhaps begin a conversation, and even that was fraught with peril. The captain's reprimand had cast a long shadow. Corporal Miller was now distant, his face a mask of professional neutrality. The easy, silent rapport they had shared over the ketchup was gone, replaced by a careful, regulated distance. Hisako felt a dull ache of responsibility. His act of kindness had cost him, and their inability to even acknowledge it felt like a form of complicity in his punishment. The feeling festered, a quiet insistence that something must be done. An opportunity arose from a mundane need. A cut on Emmy's hand required a visit to the camp's small infirmary. While the medic, an older gruff man, cleaned the wound, Hisako's trained eyes scanned the shelves. They were adequately stocked, but disorganized. A box of sterile gauze pads sat open, the squares in a messy pile. In the hospitals where she had worked, every piece of gauze was folded with geometric precision, ready for immediate use. It was a small detail, but in her world such details were the bedrock of care and efficiency. That evening in the barracks, she shared her observation. "It is not a gift," she explained in a low voice, ensuring the guards could not hear. "It is a service, an act of order, something we can do." The idea took root. It was not a forbidden offering of personal trinkets. It was a contribution of skill. Using clean, surplus scraps of cotton from the mending room, they began their work. In the dim light of the single bulb, the women sat on their cots, their hands moving with a focused, silent grace. They folded hundreds of gauze pads into perfect, uniform squares. The repetitive motion was meditative, a way of pouring their unspoken gratitude into a tangible form. Alongside the gauze, Emmy began folding something else, orizuru, paper cranes, from scraps of discarded notices. The crane, a symbol of hope and healing, was a message no translation could mistake. Soon, others joined her. The pile of delicate, white paper birds grew. Before lights out, they gathered their work. Someone had procured one of the spare white tablecloths from the laundry and spread it carefully over a central cot. Upon this makeshift altar, they arranged their offering, neat stacks of pristine gauze and a flock of nearly 100 paper cranes. It was a thing of humble beauty, a testament to their collective will. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Hisako slipped out and made her way to the infirmary. She placed the box containing the gauze and the paper cranes just inside the unlocked door, where the medic would find it upon his arrival. She did not linger. The day passed with a quiet, nervous tension. No announcement was made. No one was punished. But that evening, in the mess hall, as Hisako collected her tray, her path briefly crossed with Corporal Miller's. For a split second, their eyes met. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, and for the first time in days, the corner of his mouth lifted in a small, tired, but deeply grateful smile. The message had been received. The rain came 3 weeks later, a torrential winter downpour that turned the camp into a sea of mud. It was a violent, percussive assault, drumming against the thin tin roof of Barrack C with a fury that rattled the window panes. Inside, the air was heavy with the familiar scent of damp wool and 50 sleeping women. A sudden, deafening crack of thunder shook the entire structure, echoing with the deep, visceral report of an artillery shell. Emmy, asleep on the cot next to Hisako, cried out, a sharp, terrified sound, and sat bolt upright, her body trembling. The war was never truly over. It lived on in the nerves, waiting for a sound to call it back. Hisako was instantly awake, her own heart pounding. She reached out and pulled the thin, coarse blanket tighter around Emmy's shaking shoulders, murmuring soothing words she wasn't sure the girl could even hear over the storm. At that moment, a beam of light sliced through the oppressive darkness. It was Corporal Miller on his nightly rounds. The beam swept across the room, briefly illuminating the sign nailed to the central post. Lights out at 10 p.m. Absolute quiet. He paused when the light found the two of them, Hisako holding the trembling girl. A few weeks ago, this moment would have been fraught with terror. The enemy guard, the light, the potential for punishment. But now, Hisako saw not a faceless enemy, but the young man with the weary face who had shown them the simple joy of Ketchup, the soldier who had endured a captain's wrath for his small act of humanity. He held his torch on them for a moment longer than necessary. His expression was unreadable in the glare, but there was no menace in his stillness. He saw their fear, and in the space of that shared glance, Hisako felt a flicker of understanding pass between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement before continuing on his way, his boots squelching softly in the mud outside. Hisako held Emmy close until her trembling subsided. "Daijobu," she whispered again, the words feeling truer now than they ever had before. "We are safe." The safety she spoke of was no longer just about the absence of bombs or the presence of walls mandated by some distant convention. It was a different kind of safety, one built from shared meals on white tablecloths, from secret gifts of folded gauze, and from the quiet, dignified smile of a young man on the other side of a war. It was fragile and incomplete, but it was real. The storm passed before dawn, leaving a clean, quiet world in its wake. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a momentous announcement. The announcement came that morning. A camp administrator, a man they had never seen before, stood before them in the mess hall and read from a formal document. The words, translated by a somber interpreter, fell like stones into the quiet room. Repatriation. The process would begin in a week. They were going home. A wave of electrified shock passed through the women, followed by an explosion of joyful, tearful whispers. Home. The word itself was a prayer they had almost forgotten how to speak. But as the initial euphoria subsided, a colder, more complex reality set in. Home was no longer the place they had left. It was a land of ashes and uncertainty. The joy was tangled with a profound, unspoken fear. What and who would be waiting for them? Their final meal in the camp was a strange, subdued affair. The women spoke in low tones, sharing fragments of addresses and making vague promises to find one another again in the chaos of a rebuilt Japan. And then, the kitchen staff brought out the trays. On each one was a small, familiar pile of golden potato sticks. In the center of each white tablecloth, for one last time, stood a bright red bottle of ketchup. Hisako looked at the bottle. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had regarded it with fear and suspicion. Now, she saw it as an old acquaintance. It was the catalyst, the unlikely key that had unlocked a small door of understanding in a world sealed shut by hatred. The complex process of moving thousands of displaced persons back to Japan would be a logistical marvel, an undertaking managed by distant generals and administrators. Source: Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Records, 1947. But the real work of healing, she now understood, did not happen on official documents. It happened here, in small human moments. She uncapped the bottle and poured a final, perfect circle of red onto her tray. She picked up a potato stick, dipped it, and ate it slowly, consciously savoring the flavor. It was no longer just sweet and tangy. It tasted of a stormy night, of folded paper cranes, of a young soldier's hesitant smile. It tasted of a shared, quiet humanity. As she walked out of the camp gates a week later, carrying a small bundle of her meager possessions, Hisako knew she was carrying something more. She was taking with her the memory of a strange red sauce and the profound, simple lesson it had taught her. That sometimes the sweetest things are the ones you never expected to understand, and that even after the loudest cannons fall silent, the quietest conversations can begin with a taste of something new.